Even the busiest among us has a little downtime every day. Make better use of it with JBJS Clinical Classroom, the fast, easy, and enjoyable way to earn CME and MOC SAE credits. You'll earn 1 CME credit for every 6 correctly answered questions. And with thousands of general orthopedic and subspecialized questions available, JBJS Clinical Classroom is the only resource you'll ever need. JBJS Clinical Classroom, the fast, easy, and enjoyable way to earn CME and SAE credits.
Welcome to the Ortho Joe Show, a joint production of the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery and Ortho Evidence. In our world, orthopedic research is king, and current topics from our respective publications are analyzed weekly. Here is Mohit Bhandari from Ortho Evidence and Marc Swinkowski from the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery.
Welcome to JBJS OrthoCorps. Listen as members of the ortho community, residents, surgeons, educators, staff, and patients share their stories about the experiences and people most important in their lives and the lessons they learned along the way. OrthoCorps is an audio archive inspired by StoryCorps and independently organized by the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery.
Hello, this is Dr. Marc Swinkowski, JBJS Editor-in-Chief, and I'm here with Dr. Terry Gioe, who has recently returned to the Twin Cities. Terry was the longstanding chief of orthopedics at the VA hospital, and he succeeded our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Ed McElfresh. Here we're going to discuss Dr. McElfresh's influence on Terry's career, as Terry was a partner with Dr. McElfresh in private practice prior to Dr. McElfresh becoming chief of orthopedics at the VA. Dr. McElfresh was a hand surgeon who led the VA Department of Orthopedic Surgery for a decade. He passed away more than 20 years ago. Terry, I know you've had a long-standing relationship with Ed way before I ever met him in his capacity as chief of orthopedics at the VA. Since you know him so well, I'd just like for you to just let our listeners know, how did you meet Ed, and what were your recollections of that meeting?
Let me, first of all, Marc, let me just thank you for, offering me or affording me this opportunity to talk about Ed, who obviously I consider both a dear friend and a significant mentor in my career. It's really a pleasure. And as you and I were mentioning just before we started recording, it's hard for me to imagine that it's been over 22 years since Ed passed away. So it's nice to look back and reflect on his life and his influences. My recollection, Marc, is that I met Ed most likely, of course, I'm plumbing the depths of my own memory, most likely back in 1982, because 1982 is when I joined the residency. And my recollection, and I think this is accurate, is that Ed was part of the interview team for residency application at that point. And of course, I recall interacting with him, but I don't recall that interaction specifically in 1982. Now, that interaction became much more vigorous, for lack of a better term to use, the following year, because after my internship, which was all done in that era at Hennepin County as a G2, I went to the VA. And Ed, I think, had been at the VA since roughly 75 as hand surgery staff. I think actually the title was, chief of hand surgery at the Minneapolis VA. And of course, while you were there as a G2, and I think as a G2, we either went there for 3 or 6 months. My memory is failing me there, but you would work with Ed closely while you were on the hand rotation. And even then he was an influence on me. And, of course, I'm sure we'll get into some of those anecdotes as well. But yeah, I would have said internship year in the interview, and then G2 working with Ed closely as a staff member.
Yeah, and eventually you became one of Ed's partners, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I would say the easiest way to explain that is when I went through residency, I came to residency having done a fair amount of research and publication even before coming to residency in the field of orthopedics. I was fortunate this interview is not about me, but I was fortunate enough to work with Merrill Ritter in the past and had done some publications and things like that. So it was obvious to me that I wanted to have I wanted a career that was not dissimilar from Merrill's, in the sense that I wanted some sort of town gown connection. I wanted to have a private practice, and I wanted to do adult reconstruction. And I wanted to have a research base. I wanted to work with residents. I wanted to teach, et cetera. And at that point, St. Anthony Orthopaedic Clinic, which was Ed's private group, which was based in St. Paul, was, I think, either the largest or one of the two largest private practice groups. This was prior to the era now where the private practice groups, number 150 individuals. But I think St. Anthony at that point had about 10 partners. And 3 or 4 of those partners at the time had part-time academic teaching appointments. Hap Luter did, Wayne Thompson, I think Vince Eilers was doing some stuff at maybe the Shrine, et cetera. And so, and of course, Ed at the VA. And I was like, this is what I want. I want to be in a private practice setting. I also want to be able to do some sort of work. And Ed, and I might add by extension, Marc Dahl, who was a few years ahead of me in the residency and had joined that same group a few years before me, were instrumental in convincing me to go to that group, because it's like, we want you, and this is what you want, and this is the kind of thing we do, and we value people in our group that also give back to the teaching profession. And it was just it was a wonderful fit for me. And then to have Ed as my partner in private practice, of course, was really a blessing.
Yeah. Now, you and I both know Ed was a character in the
Yes.
strictest sense of the term. So, what are your recollections about some of the endearing qualities that Ed had, say, outside of his abilities as a hand surgeon?
Well, I tell you something. Ed was Ed was just a terrific person, and I'm sure anyone you would interview would say the same thing about him. I think one of the things that was most fascinating to me about Ed, and part of it is that we share some of those qualities or characteristics, is that I think the common, and this was, again, let's recall that this was 30, 40 or more years ago, the common perception at that point, I think, of orthopedic surgeons were the jock, the brash, confident individual, you broke the bone, I'm going to fix it type of thing. And Ed was the antithesis of that. Ed was I always thought of Ed as almost British in his comportment, a very dry wit, very quiet. If he was interacting with people, it was almost always conciliatory. His communication skills were, always about, can we bring people together? It was never this, my way or the highway type of thing. So I think of him in that way. I think as far as some of the things that were just character-like about him, I think we'll discuss more when we talk about some of his interests. But he was, Can I just go ahead and maybe talk about? Yeah, let me go ahead and talk about some of Ed's interests, because I think they really play into how he's commonly remembered and commonly thought of. To the point that I just made about his reserved character and that sort of thing. This, again, may be more typical of hand surgeons in general, but Ed loved books, as you know, and book collecting. Ed loved classical music. So, it is just perhaps the almost stereotype of the hand surgeon with the loops and sitting quietly in in the surgical suite with classical lute music playing, that sort of thing. That was Ed. And Ed's interest, who knows when it started, I'm sure well before medical school, but he published, I remember, a thesis in medical school on something to do with surgery in 18th century England. This was back when there was a thesis required in medical school. He went to Nebraska for medical school. And perhaps out of that, or perhaps out of some other underlying interest, one of his great loves was collecting medical texts. And we are fortunate, as you know, to have the McElfresh Library there at the university, which houses a lot of his collection. And so Ed was a huge medical book collector. And if he went to a meeting, and I was with him in many meetings, he would always seek out the antiquarian bookstore and be looking for some specific medical text, or maybe he had ordered it and it had come in at some bookstore in New Orleans or whatever. I think it was a huge pleasure for him to find other people who shared those kinds of interests and to pass those books along. And, and in that sense, I have a couple of anecdotes. One is that for me personally, and this of course was before I had fully developed my career, but he knew I was interested in adult reconstruction. Ed gave me a first edition of Charnley's closed reduction of common fractures, or closed treatment of common fractures, I think is the name of the book. It was a first edition. And he knew that would have special meaning to me because it was, done by Charnley. I talked to one of our friends and colleagues, Anne Van Heest, about her relationship to Ed. And she reminded me that Ed had passed on a first edition Bunnell's book on hand surgery to Anne. As an early faculty member at the university, of course, as a hand surgeon, and how meaningful that was to her, and even more meaningful that Ed had passed it on to her with a note that he wanted her to have this because of Ed's disease, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. He knew he wasn't going to be around forever, and he wanted to make sure that the books that he had, that he really treasured and really valued, were passed on to others who felt the same way about it. So yeah, I can't speak enough about how much Ed was into books. I think the other thing, and I'll touch on it briefly, and we may circle back to it, but I think the other thing, of course, that everyone recalls about Ed is what a gourmand he was. He was absolutely a foodie, I guess would be the term now, before that term was popular. And so I joked, in fact, I used this line in Ed's eulogy many years ago. I said, if there was a New Delhi in New Delhi, Ed would tell you about it. And so it was not uncommon at all for partners, or even folks who weren't partners, to come up to Ed and say, hey, Ed, I'm going to be in St. Louis next week. Is there any place I should check? Oh, St. Louis, let me tell you about this barbecue joint that, and absolutely any city you could name, Ed would give you some recommendation about where to go. So again, I'm sure we'll expand on that more, and I'll just leave it at that. But I would say those two things about book collecting and his interest in food and drink were just phenomenal.
Yes, I recall conversations with him when talking about which symposia to go to at the Academy meeting, and he didn't want to talk about that at all. He wanted to talk about the list of restaurants he was going to that week.
Absolutely. I'll share an anecdote. I'll share one more anecdote in that regard. The very first Academy that I went to as a private practice orthopedic surgeon, not as a resident, was in 1987, right after graduation for me. And that Academy meeting was in San Francisco. And Ed decided, I'm sure you've at least heard the name of this restaurant. It's no longer in business, but it was huge for a period of time. Ed decided that we all needed to go to Massa's in San Francisco, which was a very high-end, very elite, premier restaurant. Of course, I don't know the names of the chefs, but Ed would have, probably knew them personally. And he decided to take a number of us, I think they were primarily partners, but maybe some other faculty members, to Massa. Now, of course, this wasn't, unfortunately, on Ed's tab. We were all going to split the tab. So I'm a brand new, orthopedic surgeon. I'm on salary. I mean, at this point for the first year in the practice. And we go in, and mind you, this is 87. This is not, 2022. And, you start looking at the prices and you think, wow, my share of this is going to be substantial. And then Ed brings out the wine list. And of course, he's also a oenophile. So, it's like, okay, terrific. We're going to have a $300 bottle of wine. And I literally, I think there were 6 or 7 people there. And I think my share of the meal came to something like $300 or $400. And I'm like, okay, this is going to be a sort of expensive lifestyle if I always go out to eat with Ed. But, it wasn't always about that kind of dining for Ed. It was always about finding something unique and different. And I think he was very excited about going to Massa's, because I think at that point it had been only open for a few years or something, and had quite the national reputation. So,
yeah. I think the term Renaissance man is thrown around a little bit too frequently, but I think Ed would fall into that category. So I recall the first time I had a conversation, I was the chair of orthopedics at the time, but Ed was the head of VA, and he sat down and basically after a few, side stories and trivial conversation, he basically said, I have a congenital lung disease that's going to kill me. And I think based on my family tree and what's happened in my family, I've got a couple, 3 years. So you need to start to be thinking about my successor, because I'm not going to be here.
Right.
That was, I'd never quite had an individual be so forthright and transparent and not emotional at all, just very sincere about what needed to happen. And what are your recollections about Ed's thinking about his disease and planning for his life, end of his life?
Those are great questions, Mark. It's really interesting. Ed was the chief of the VA between 1994 and 2000. And I'm sure you're probably aware of this, or at least peripherally aware of it. But there were a few of us who always, who had been around when, of course, Dr. Premer was the chief at the VA,
right,
and knew how the position, or knew at least how we felt the position should be handled and should go forward, not necessarily to honor Bud's legacy, because clearly the VA needed to be, brought forward into a more modern way of functioning than it was during Bud's era. But knowing how the interaction with the residents and the patients occurred, and the interaction with the university and this and that occurred. And those people included Ed, obviously, and myself and Dick Schmidt. Now, Ed and Dick were both classmates and fraternity brothers at the University of Nebraska in medical school before they came here. And Dick and I, of course, were good colleagues and good friends working part-time at the VA in that period of time when Ed was the chief. And so we actually had discussions about sort of, not that we had complete control over that, but we had sort of discussions about the chain of succession when Ed were to pass. And it's like, well, maybe Dick will take over. You're not ready to do that, Terry. And then maybe after Dick, Terry, and that sort of thing. And of course, as you know, that is indeed how it evolved. One of the nice things, which is almost, it's serendipitous, but it's sort of interesting about Ed's time at the VA as the chief with his disease, is that during the period of time that Ed was there, the department was remodeled, and the offices for the orthopedic surgeons, which were lovely at the time, actually were taken from patients' rooms. This was the transition. The VA was a 900-bed inpatient hospital, right, and transitioning to having 200 inpatients or whatever. Right. So they took a wing, and not an entire wing, but a portion of a wing that were patient rooms, and made them into orthopedic staff offices. And of course, Ed had a large one, but the beauty of that is it had its own bathroom, and more importantly, it had its own oxygen source. So Ed had this office. I mean, not that you couldn't do that with portable oxygen, but Ed had this office where, there was oxygen basically in the wall. And so a couple of things that I remember. One is that Ed was a very proud individual and didn't want to dwell on any aspect of his infirmity. And so although it was suggested many times, gee, Dr. McElfresh will meet you at the door to the hospital and, wheel you up to your office or whatever, so you don't have to expend the energy to get there with your pulmonary disease. No, he would not hear of that. And it took him some time, but he would get to his office and, there would be oxygen and this and that. And I remember him never wanting to make a big deal out of that. I think the biggest thing to me about Ed's disease, when I reflect on it, is the actual end. And I'm hoping I can get through this portion without being emotional. One of Ed's greatest honors, and I know you can understand this because you've been around for much of this. One of Ed's greatest honors, and there were many honors, was that he was named Teacher of the Year by the orthopedic residents in 1998. And in 2000, I was fortunate enough to be named Teacher of the Year. And that award was given at the graduation banquet, as I believe it still typically is. And Ed was there. Ed was present at that 2000 graduation when I was awarded Teacher of the Year, and I got up and gave a short speech, and I credited Ed and many other of my mentors, et cetera. And the irony of that, Mark, is that while we were there, it was actually as the meeting was breaking up, Ed wore a pager specifically for this. He got a page from the university saying, we've got a donor. We've got your lung transplant donor. Get over here to the university. So Ed got to see me receive the Teacher of the Year award, which was incredibly meaningful to him and of course to me as well. Then he went into the hospital to get his lung transplant and didn't emerge. Ultimately didn't emerge. And it was so nasty, brutish, and short, as they say about life, in the sense that there was a period of time after he received the transplant where Ed looked as good as I had ever seen him for the last 2 or 3 years. I would go visit him. He was chipper. He was, it's like, wow, Ed, you look terrific. This is going to be great. I can't wait. And then, as you know, complications ensued, hepatitis C, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, he never left the hospital. But I will always remember just the confluence of those events between him being so proud of me that someone that he considered a mentee and I consider a mentor had also gotten the same award that he had gotten. And then the tragedy of leaving that evening with so much promise, the promise of the transplant, but of course not ultimately working out.
Yes, what a wonderful, wonderful man. But in closing, what do you think Ed would prefer, or how do you think Ed would prefer to be remembered as a person who knew him as well as anyone?
Well, I think I have so many more anecdotes we could share about Ed, but let me just say that I think that one of the ways Ed would want to be remembered, besides the things we've talked about, he took pride in the fact that he was a bibliophile, that he enjoyed books, et cetera. I remember, sorry, this is an aside. I remember that one of the great lines that I had told him about, or I used on him, and I think I used it at the point where we dedicated the McElfresh Library, is there's this great Groucho Marx quote that is, outside of a dog, books are man's best friend. Inside of a dog, it's too dark to read. And I remember telling Ed that once because I knew he would appreciate it. And he just thought that is like the greatest quote. So, I know he would want to be remembered as a bibliophile. I think he'd want to be remembered for, some of the other hobbies and interests he had, like the gourmand stuff that we talked about. But I think when we think about him as a partner, the most endearing thing was really his communication skills. He was so low key and so wonderful. And as partners, we would sometimes joke with him about the complications that he would describe to patients as potential outcomes. And again, just to make a point on this, Ed would talk about carpal tunnel release with a patient. And, death, potential death would be one of the complications. You have to understand there's anesthetic involved, you're like, gosh, I don't think this is going to happen with a carpal tunnel, but I guess for completeness sake, Ed wants to really make sure he's complete. And he was always so thorough. I remember back in one of Ed's big research interests was Dupuytren's contracture. And Ed utilized a technique that I don't believe he developed. It was known as the McElfresh technique, but he certainly popularized it because we had a large population of World War II veterans with Dupuytren's at that point. The so-called McElfresh technique, where you would have open incisions in the palm, and they would heal by secondary intention. You would splint them, you would splint these patients, and then they had to do daily dressing changes. And these are World War II veterans. And so they'd have to be taught how to do these dressing changes on these open wounds in their hand. The success rate was phenomenal. And part of that was Ed explaining to patients very precisely how they have to do this. And they worked with occupational therapists, et cetera. It was terrific. I also remember one of his PAs told me about a story where Ed, in addition to his idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, had rosacea. And she told me about an anecdote where Ed was explaining to a mother and a child something about an osteotomy to correct a deformity that had occurred as a result of a both bone forearm fracture or something. And so he's going through all of this with the child, and he turns to the child. The child was, I guess, 10 or 12. And, he's going to also ask the parent, it's like, do you have any questions, Johnny, about, what we're going to do? And the kid said, what are those red spots on your face? Which of course was, Ed's rosacea. And Ed just very calmly sat down, explained rosacea, why I have these red spots on my face. So that was Ed. He was calm. He could explain anything to anyone. He took his time. It wasn't, I've got my hand on the doorknob as soon as I walk in the door to walk out the door, sit down, let me explain to this child my dermatologic condition. Which you can imagine nowadays wouldn't fly. It was, his communication skills were second to none. I've got to tell one last anecdote, and it's one that Ann passed on to me, and one that after she mentioned it, Ann Van Heest, after she mentioned it, I recalled as well. And that was that Ed always thought it was very important to operate with both hands, that you'd be able to not be truly ambidextrous, but you have the ability to use both hands in surgery. And Ann said that before she rotated with him, she had heard about this tendency of Dr. McElfresh's from other residents. So the first case that she did with Ed, before he said anything, she made a point of picking, she's right-handed, she made a point of picking up the scalpel with the left hand to do something with it and do something else with the left hand. And then he, commented on it and praised her. And after that, their friendship was cemented. It's like, you want to be a hand surgeon and you can operate with your left hand, you're in, it was great. So, we could speak, I know, for some time about Ed's qualities and endearments, but it's been a lot of fun for me to recall some of those stories and recall the influence he had on my own life too. I really relish the opportunity.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Terry, for giving the listening audience a great sense of a wonderful, true Renaissance man that we all knew and loved, and have great recollection of what he meant to us. And I think this will help people who didn't know him quite so well really understand the sense of a really wonderful Scotsman.
Yeah, well, that's great. I remember when we set this up, you said, well, it'll go about 15 minutes depending on how much fun we have. So it's probably gone over 15 minutes, but regardless, it's been a pleasure again. Thanks so much, Marc.
Yeah.
Take care.